Okay, so welcome to the first tutorial on After Effects. This tutorial is really just going to cover what the interface is like and the introduction to how to work in After Effects and some of the conventions used in After Effects and how they differ from Premiere, since that's what we're moving to. So first, right, when it pops up, this window comes up, it tells you about the new fancy features, which actually being able to taper paths and stuff is amazing. I'm really excited that that's now part of this. But so the first thing we're going to do is we'll just create a new project. And when we do that, this is the default window that pops up. And so, so we've got several panes here, right? Similar to Premiere, whichever one is highlighted in blue is the one that's currently selected and the one you're currently working in, right? So right now I'm in the project pane, and the project pane is very similar to the project pane or panel in Premiere, right? This is this blank space here is where all of my clips, my footage, images, any other assets that I'm going to be using for my project will appear. And to import something to use in After Effects, all I have to do is double click in this space, and the input will pop up. And you can see I actually have an After Effects project that I could pull in here, and maybe I'll do that in a second, but for now I'm going to cancel that and wonder why this is running so slow, but whatever. Right, so you can also hit Command or Control I on the keyboard to import something. Or you can go up to File and go down to Import, and you can either import a file, multiple files, etc. Okay, so then this main window here is the composition window. And instead of having sequences as you have in Premiere, in After Effects, the main thing that you'll be working in is called a composition. And each project can have multiple compositions, and you can actually nest one composition in another, and that's something we're going to do because it makes your life a lot easier when you have really complex animated scenes. And so you can create a new composition either by clicking on just a new blank composition or new composition from footage. We're not going to do this yet. We will in just a short second. Also, once we create that, there's a bunch of icons up here that are most of the tools that you're going to be using. Many of them are grayed out right now because we don't have anything in our composition. If we continue to the left, this window over here, these little tabs basically allow us to control several different things. This is general info about where we are in the composition, audio levels, settings for previewing the composition, including play and everything else. Effects and presets, right? This is After Effects, so there should be a lot of effects that can be used in here. And there are a ton. You can go through, I'm not going to do this now, but you can go through and look at all of these different options in here. And then there's alignment tools, right? So if you're trying to align either your layers or, right, and that's kind of how After Effects works, right? Each composition is composed of several layers. And so then, there's libraries, right? Which in this case, I have these color swatches I was using for a different project. There's characters, right? So when you're working with text, you can control all your characters. There's the paragraph one as well. Tracker, we will look at motion tracking and how you can actually track motion of an object in a video with After Effects. And there's a couple different things you can do. So then you can essentially, like if you wanted, if somebody was carrying a blank sign, through your footage and you wanted to attach some text to that, you can essentially track that blank sign as the person walks across the scene. And if it's rotating or twisting, you can even go so far as to basically make your content look like it's in perspective with, say, that blank sign. And then content-aware fill. If you want to remove something from your footage and have it actually essentially like totally matte, like look like it was never there, content-aware fill allows you to do that. And that's something that's somewhat new, and I haven't honestly used very much, so I'll have to find some footage where I want to take something out and do a few tests before I do a tutorial on that. So the bottom window down here is the timeline for our composition, and this is where all of our layers are going to appear. And so if I go ahead and I'm going to say new composition from footage, just because then it'll make a layer all on its own. So I'm going to say new composition from footage. I'm going to come in here and I'm just going to grab one of the outputs of this previous project. And I'm just going to do this Ames Reliable TV 1 MP4. If you've got other video files on your computer, go ahead and pull those in. Right, so in my case, so what it's done is it's created this layer. You can see it's created a composition up here, and it's got this video file here. And this shows this QuickTime icon. I'm not sure what it shows in Windows, but there's a similar thing that basically it's a film strip. It shows that it is footage, or it'll show that it's an image. And so if I have my timeline selected, you'll see my current composition is here, and this is the layer that's in that composition. And if I go ahead and just hit the space bar on my keyboard, right, I can start playing this. And so we're creating a TV station in Ames potentially. And so this is like part of that. And I did this composition in After Effects. You'll notice that sometimes it pauses and stops and doesn't render all of the frames, but right, that's the way this is. And so this logo, I actually created, so it's from an old sign, a historic sign for Ames Reliable Feeds. And I went ahead and changed some of those things and used this to make this this super cheeseball like 80s public access logo kind of thing for a TV station for FABA. All right, so this is the layer, and I just want to kind of show you some of the things that we have access to and how to access those things. There's a lot going on here that we're not going to talk about yet. But so first, what we're going to do is there's a little drop. There's an right. There's an eye here, which right is the universal sign for is this layer visible or not. And then there's a little drop down arrow next to the colored square here, and that drop down arrow allows us to see some of our settings, right? Whereas whereas Premiere has the effect controls in a separate window. In After Effects, all of those controls are available on the timeline. And so you'll see these things may look familiar from Premiere, right? There's anchor point, position, scale, rotation, and opacity, right? So I can hover over any of these blue numbers to click and drag to adjust them, right? If I want to reduce the opacity or increase the opacity of this, I can do that. The rotation, the numbers back here, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see this better. The numbers back here are going to go from 0 to 359. And then if you want to make multiple rotations, which when you say you want this to spin 3 times over 3 seconds, then you would just put a 3 in the front end, and that would make sure it did 3 full rotations, right? And if you want it to rotate, and that's to rotate clockwise, if you want it to rotate clockwise, counterclockwise, you do -3. And then the scale should make sense, 100%, whatever scale you want this to be. Position, and then the anchor point, right, defines the center of the image. It's this part here. So if you move your anchor point, say, to a corner, then you could rotate this around the corner or the side or just somewhere else in the scene. And we'll talk more about positioning anchor points when we look at parent-child relationships, say, to be able to animate an arm or something like that, where you have maybe 3 different pieces that are connected, and how to pin those together. All right, so if I rotate, I can rotate this, right, and and you'll see as I rotate it, the resolution goes down. Right, so it's 118 degrees. I'm going to set that back to 0. To keyframe things, right, which we've done previously in Premiere, like if I want to say I want to keyframe the opacity so it becomes more opaque as it fades in, all I do is I click on the little stopwatch icon here, and that allows me to drop in a keyframe. And it's set to whatever I have this set to. So I'm going to set this to 0. And then if I scroll forward some, let's say, I don't know, 2 seconds in, and this is where I want it to be 100% opacity. So then I can either click on this little diamond here to create a new keyframe, or I can just set the value to something different. So if I set it to 100 here, it'll create another keyframe, right? And so with this, every option that we have, all those keyframes are available in essentially to the right of the item. And so now if I scroll through this and I hit play, right, you'll see that it slowly fades in before it gets larger. To move these keyframes, right, I can just click and drag them anywhere on the timeline, right? So if I want this, this fade to be smaller, and I want you to notice that, right, it's not playing back at real time right now. It's thinking really hard as it's trying to render these different frames, right? So with After Effects, one of the things, because we're doing so much effects work, it has to render all of those previews, right? And once it's solid green, you've rendered all of the frames, and it should play back at real time. Okay, so I've set that. And then to jump from one keyframe to the next, you click on these little arrows, right? And that will hop you to the next keyframe. When this gets highlighted, this diamond is highlighted as blue, you're on a keyframe. That helps you because if you're off by one frame and you think you're on the keyframe, it's going to be gray. And so this is a really good way if you're, adjusting keyframes to make sure you are on the keyframe that you want to be on. So let's add an effect because I want to show you how some of those things, what those look like. So I'm going to pull my playhead a little bit further over so it's 100% opaque. Oh, yep, opaque. And I'm going to go to Effects and Presets over here. And let's just do something that's going to be obvious as soon as we apply it. So I'm going to go to Stylize, and under Stylize, I'm going to go to Find Edges. And so I'm going to select that, and if I double click on it, with this layer currently selected, then it's going to be applied to this layer. And so now you'll see, here's my effect controls, and notice that there's this arrow here, so I can either have effect controls or project available here right now. So I've got my effect control set. Now I can change the effects here, right? So currently blend with original is set to 0, which basically means I'm seeing this effect as intense as it's going to be. And Find Edges has one other option, which is invert, right? So I can either invert it so it's black or leave it white. In this case, I'll leave it white. And if I adjust blend with original, right, I can either make it totally transparent or I can tweak the amount it's blending. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and set this to 0 for now. Note that I can keyframe either of these things. And something else that happens on this layer when I add an effect is I get this effects dropdown. And so in the effects dropdown, I have any other effects that I created, right? Like if I was to then add glow to this, and I don't know, Mr. Smoothie, right? I can add these effects and they all show up here, and they also show up right in my effect controls. So sometimes it's easier to just use the effect controls here to adjust things. Other times, if I'm trying to keyframe things and actually have the keyframes align with other effects at the same time or other settings, I can do that down here too. So I just flip open whichever one I want to work on, right? Glow has a lot of options, right? And then to turn an effect on or off, I just click on that little FX thing, and then I can eliminate these. And order is important, right? So if I say, if I turn glow off, I turn Mr. Smoothie on, and pull this out a little bit, right? It does some really crazy things to this. But right now, if I do glow first, right, it's going to be applying the Mr. Smoothie to glow. Whereas if I click on Mr. Smoothie and drag it up, I can have Mr. Smoothie happen first, and then glow gets applied to Mr. Smoothie, right? And so order does become really important. Okay, and so down here, right, I can do the same thing. I can make any of those adjustments to any of these settings that I need, right? If we turn these off and just do find edges, because it's simple, right, I can turn invert on or off. I can adjust my blend with original here, right? So I can set it somewhere in the middle. I have no idea why it's so completely pixelated. There it goes. It just took it forever to render that. And then under the compositing options, there's also the effect opacity, right? So I can go through here and actually just reduce the percentage of the effect as well, right? So I have a couple options. In this case, right, blend with original and effect opacity are basically the same thing. But in a lot of effects, right, you don't have that blend with original option, right? Like Mr. Smoothie doesn't have that. So if I want to blend it, I need to reduce the effect opacity there. And so some other things to note, there's the little mountain and the big mountain here allows me to either zoom in or out on my timeline, right? So I can go down to the frame level or zoom out. If I click on this toggle switches and modes option, it's going to change things. And one of the things it changes is it opens up this ability to select how this layer blends with layers below it. And there's also this parenting and this track mat, and we're not going to talk about that yet. And then if I click the button again, right, there's all of these other options, and we'll talk about what these different things do. Right, this effects button, if I turn that off, it automatically turns all the effects on my layer off. And we'll talk about some of these other things further down the line. There's some other ways of viewing information on here that we're not going to talk about until a little bit later when we deal with some animating some things. Additionally, at the top of the screen, there are several menu options here. There's the composition thing where you can create new compositions. You can deal with composition settings, which we'll talk about in a bit, but this is basically where you set the resolution of the composition, the frame rate of the composition, and the background color, if you always have a background color, and then the duration as well. So right, this thing is 11 seconds and 1 frame long, which is the length of the footage I brought in there. But by default, I think 30 seconds is the default length of a composition. Under the layer menu, there's lots of options for all sorts of layers, and we'll get into what most of these are. We're probably not going to do a Cinema 4D layer, but we can talk about creating a Photoshop file, this content aware fill layer, adjustment layers, right? And we'll definitely do shape layers, null objects, camera, light, solid, text, etc. And then there's a bunch of other options in here, and we'll talk about many of these things. And then under effects, this is just another place where rather than going to the effects and presets on the right, you can also grab your effects and apply your effects from here. Animation, we'll talk a little bit about later, but this is kind of where, along with doing keyframing stuff down on the timeline, you can also do some keyframing things here. And the view, zoom in, zoom out, resolution. Right now it's set to full, and that's why it's taking so long. for everything to render, right? If I go to half, then it's going to be a little chunkier. But when I go to create preview frames, those preview frames will be created faster. And so as I'm working with this, even though I don't have full resolution, I can see the motion more quickly. And under Window, there are several different workspaces that you can use. Right, currently we're on the default, and we'll talk about some of these and what they what the use is. Something to note that messes people up pretty frequently is if you double click on a layer, suddenly you have your composition has this, and certain things have disappeared, and you're really confused as to why this is happening. What's happened is you've opened a layer tab in this preview window, and so the layer tab, this is just this one layer, and it allows you to do certain things. One of which is called Rotoscoping, which is where you basically create a mask around a figure, or to cut them out of the background, or vice versa. You have an object that you want to replace with something else, you can use rotoscoping to do that as well. And it essentially masks or cuts out this figure. And rotoscoping and the roto brush allows you to essentially have the computer help you do that work. And you have to be in this view to do that. And there's some other things where you have to be in the layer view to get them to work. So that's just a note, and you can switch back and forth between the two. So this is a general introduction. What I would like you to do as like an output for this is to open this up, go into After Effects, add some effects, maybe just play with trying to keyframe some things on there, rotate, just do something totally silly. You could bring in a static image, you could bring in moving footage, but I want you to just take some time and play and see what these different things do. We haven't even talked about, say, the pen tool or the text tool, and some of them, like the roto brush tool, will not work, as I said, unless you're in the layer. But the pen tool allows you to draw both shapes and draw masks on a layer, so you can use it to cut certain things out. And I'm really excited for all of us to learn this. After Effects is more complex than Premiere, because it just allows you to do a ton of animation, animate a lot of stuff, and do a lot of interesting work in here. And so that is the introduction. And yeah, please import some footage and just have fun, destroy it, add effects, see how things work, and play. All right, that's all I got.